Hi, I'm Corey Humphries, or WeCJ, and welcome to Commander Class. In today's class, we will be going over manlands. Now, you're probably thinking, what are manlands? I never heard of them. I've seen them load, but never actually heard the word manlands until I started doing research for this video. So a manland is a land that can become a creature solely on its own. So I thought there's like Nisses that do it and sorceries and do it. So do they become manlands? No. It is primarily when it comes to the text of the card. It taps for mana, it can do other abilities, but it becomes a manland when you can tap mana into the land itself and it becomes a creature. Now, some of these I know mainly because some of them became box stoppers and really good beautiful art cards in other sets. So I've seen one or two of these before. I personally got a box stopper in Return to Zendikar of the Dimir one, which I'll be showing later on, and I was super happy with that card, but I never knew it was a manland until I started doing research for this video. So when it comes to recording this video, I'll be going through the colourless ones, the monocolored ones, and then the dual colour ones. If this type isn't your thing where I read out the cards and stuff like this, I do get all my information on the Magic the Gathering wiki type of thing. So if you ever want to read and look at the cards yourself, again, link will be in the bio of where I get my information from. So when it comes to the colourless manlands, there is a total of 16 in total. So I think this is the most ever cards I've ever read out at once. One or two of them I know from playing the game for years. One is quite an expensive land, the one that turns itself into a creature with Infect, which is a really good way to win a game. And I do have an Infect deck, or I am building an Infect deck if you want to, because it's not finished, and I would probably get that land in there. So here are all 16 coming on screen now. Blinkmoth Nexus, it's a land that's a rare. It taps for a waste. Tap 1, Blinkmoth Nexus becomes a 1/1 Blinkmoth artifact creature with flying until end of turn. It's still a land. Tap 1 and it, target Blinkmoth creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Crawling Barrens is a land that's a rare. Tap, add a waste. Tap 4, put 2 1/1 counters on Crawling Barrens. Then you may have it become a 0/0 elemental creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Dread Sentry, it's a land that's an uncommon. Tap, add a waste to your mana pool. Tap 4, Dread Sentry becomes a 4/2 golem artifact creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Faceless Haven, it's a snow land that's a rare. Tap, add a waste. For 3 snow, Faceless Haven becomes a 4/3 creature with vigilance and all creature types until end of turn. It's still a land. Frostwalk Bastion, it's a snow land that's an uncommon. Tap, add a waste. For 1 in a snow, until end of turn, Frostwalk Bastion becomes a 2/3 construct artifact creature. It's still a land. Whenever Frostwalk Bastion deals combat damage to a creature, tap that creature and it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Hostile Desert, it's a land that's a desert that's a rare. Tap, add a waste. Tap 2, exile a land card from your graveyard. Hostile Desert becomes a 3/4 elemental creature token until end of turn and it's still a land. Inkmoth Nexus, it's a land that's a rare. Tap, add 1 to your mana pool. For 1, Inkmoth Nexus becomes a 1/1 Blinkmoth artifact creature with flying and infect until end of turn. It's still a land. Mishra's Factory, it's a land that's an uncommon. Tap, add a waste. Tap 1, Mishra's Factory becomes a 2/2 assembly work artifact creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Tap, target assembly worker creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Mishra's Foundry, it's a land that's a rare. Tap, add a waste. Tap 2, Mishra's Foundry becomes a 2/2 assembly work artifact creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Tap 1 and it, target attacking assembly worker gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Mobilized District, it's a land that's a rare. Tap, add a waste. Tap 4, Mobilized District becomes a 3/3 citizen creature with vigilance until end of turn. It's still a land. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature and planeswalker you control. Mutavault, it's a land that's a rare. Tap, add a waste. Tap 1, Mutavault becomes a 2/2 creature with all creature types until end of turn. It's still a land. Nantuku Monastery, it's a land that's an uncommon. Tap, add 1 mana to your mana pool. It has Threshold for green and white. Nantuku Monastery becomes a 4/4 green and white insect monk creature with first strike until end of turn. It's still a land. Activate this ability only if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Stalking Stones, it's a land that's an uncommon. Tap, add 1 to your mana pool. Tap 6, Stalking Stone becomes a 3/3 elemental artifact creature that's still a land. Svargoths, the Relentless Tomb, it's a land that's an uncommon. Tap, add a waste. For 3 black and a green, until end of turn, Svargoths, the Relentless Tomb becomes a black and green plant zombie creature with this creature's power and toughness is equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. It's still a land. Westvale Abbey, it's a land that's rare. Tap, add a waste to your mana pool. Tap 5 and 8, pay a life, put a 1/1 white and black human cleric creature token onto the battlefield. Tap 5 and 8, sacrifice 5 creatures, transform Westvale Abbey, then untap it. Zotic Cavern, it's a land that's an uncommon. Tap, add a waste to your mana pool, and it has morph for 2. So the second ones I'll be going over are the monocolor lands. There's 10 of them in total, but they kind of have broken off into 2 sets of 5. So it'll be a WUBRG and then a second WUBRG from 2 different sets. So I'll be going over all 10 now on screen. For Binding Watchtower, it's a land that's an uncommon. For Binding Watchtower enters battlefield tapped, tap, add a white to your mana pool. For 1 and a white for Binding Watchtower becomes a 1/5 white soldier creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Fairy Conclave, it's a land that's an uncommon. Fairy Conclave enters battlefield tapped, tap, add a blue to your mana pool. For 1 and a blue, Fairy Conclave becomes a 2/1 blue fairy creature with flying until end of turn. It's still a land. Spawning Pool, it's a land that's an uncommon. Spawning Pool comes into play tapped, tap, add a black to your mana pool. For 1 and a black, Spawning Pool becomes a 1/1 black skeleton creature with tap a black, regenerate this creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Jintu Encampment, it's a land that's an uncommon. Jintu Encampment enters battlefield tapped, tap, add a red to your mana pool. For 1 and a red, Jintu Encampment becomes a 2/1 red warrior creature with first strike until end of turn. It's still a land. Treetop Village, it's a land that's an uncommon. Treetop Village enters battlefield tapped, tap, add a green. For 1 and a green, Treetop Village becomes a 3/3 green ape creature with trample until end of turn. It's still a land. Cave of the Frost Dragon, it's a land that's a rare. If you control 2 or more other lands, Cave of the Frost Dragon enters battlefield tapped. It taps for a white. For 4 and a white, Cave of the Frost Dragon becomes a 3/4 white dragon creature with flying until end of turn. It's still a land. Hall of the Storm Giants, the land that's a rare. If you control 2 or more of the lands, Hall of the Storm Giant enters the battlefield tapped, taps for a blue. For 5 and a blue until end of turn, Hall of the Storm Giants becomes a 7/7 blue giant creature with ward 3. It's still a land. Hive of the Eye Tyrant, it's a land that's a rare. If you control 2 or more of the lands, Hive of the Eye Tyrant enters the battlefield tapped. For 3 and a black until end of turn, Hive of the Eye Tyrant becomes a 3/3 black behold creature with menace. And whenever this creature attacks, exile target card from defending player's graveyard. It's still a land. Den of the Bugbear, it's a land that's a rare. If you control 2 or more of the lands, Den of the Bugbear enters battlefield tapped, taps for a red. For 3 and a red until end of turn, Den of the Bugbear becomes a 3/2 red goblin creature with, whenever this creature attacks, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. It's still a land. Lair of the Hydra, it's a land that's a rare. If you control 2 or more of the lands, Lair of the Hydra enters battlefield tapped. It taps for a green. X and green until end of turn, Lair of the Hydra becomes an XX green Hydra creature. It's still a land. X can't be 0. And then finally the dual ones, and this is the one that I have in the altar. If there is a super pretty altar, I think there is in 2, I'll be putting the altar on screen. There's 10 of them in total, 5 of them allied and 5 of them enemied. So I'll be going over the allied ones first, and then I'll be going over the enemied ones second. And here they are all on screen now. Celestial Colonnade, it's a land that's a mythic. Celestial Colonnade enters the battlefield tapped. It taps for a white or blue. For 3 white and blue, until end of turn, Celestial Colonnade becomes a 4/4 white and blue elemental creature with flying and vigilance. It's still a land. Creeping Tar Pit, it's a land that's a mythic. Creeping Tar Pit enters battlefield tapped. It taps for a blue or black. For 1 blue and a black, Creeping Tar Pit becomes a 3/2 blue and black elemental creature until end of turn. and can't be blocked this turn, it's still a land. Lava Claw Reaches, it's a land that's a mythic. Lava Claw Reaches enter the battlefield tapped. It taps for a black or red, for 1 black and a red. Until end of turn, Lava Claw Reaches becomes a 2/2 black and red elemental creature with X. This creature gets +X/+0 until end of turn, it's still a land. Raging Ravine, it's a land that's a mythic. Raging Ravine enters the battlefield tapped. It taps for a red or green, for 2 red and a green until end of turn. Raging Ravine becomes a 3/3 red and green elemental creature with, whenever this creature attacks, put a 1/1 counter on it, it's still a land. Stirring Wildwood, it's a land that's a mythic. Stirring Wildwood enters battlefield tapped, taps for a green or white, for 1 green and a white until end of turn. Stirring Wildwood becomes a 3/4 green and white elemental creature with reach, it's still a land. Shambling Vent, it's a land that's a rare. Shambling Vent enters the battlefield tapped, taps for a white or black. For 1 white and a black, Shambling Vent becomes a 2/3 white and black elemental creature with lifelink until end of turn, it's still a land. Wandering Fumarole enters the battlefield tapped, taps for a blue or red, for 2 blue and a red until end of turn. Wandering Fumarole becomes a 1/4 blue and red elemental creature with 0. Switch this creature's power and toughness until end of turn, it's still a land. Hissing Quagmire, it's a land that's a rare. Hissing Quagmire enters the battlefield tapped. Tap, add a black or green to your mana pool. 1 black and a green, Hissing Quagmire becomes a 2/2 black and green elemental creature with Death Touch until end of turn, it's still a land. Needle Spires, it's a land that's a rare. Needle Spires enters the battlefield tapped. Tap, add a red or white. For 2 red and a white, Needle Spires becomes a 2/1 red and white elemental creature with double strike until end of turn, it's still a land. Lumbering Falls, it's a land that's a rare. Lumbering Falls enters the battlefield tapped. It taps for a green or blue. Tap 2 green and blue. Lumbering Falls becomes a 3/3 green and blue elemental creature with hexproof until end of turn, it's still a land. Now that we've gone over the man lands, let me know which is your favorite in the comments down below, and if you play any of them, let me know because I kind of want to see how used these lands are. But when it comes to next week's class, we'll be going over strip lands. And if you liked this video, I have last week's class here. I have the playlist of every single commander class that I've done right here. We're nearly on our 30th commander class, but also if you're interested in the stuff, I have a subscribe button here that you should click on and definitely subscribe, and remember to like and follow me on all my other social medias, and I will see you all in the next video.